Hi guys, so first thing I would love for you to do, there should be a tab on each of your tables. You're going to need to create a new section of your notebooks that is labeled Period 7 Imperialism, also called Colonialism. Right up here, you can see the title, so Period 7 Imperialism. If you need more time for that, go ahead and push pause because I've got limited time to talk to you using the free recorder. So imperialism is kind of an extension of manifest destiny. We're going to talk about that. Here's your quick intro. So global competition, primarily by the British, prompts the United States to expand its influence and territory. It will create a situation in which we get involved in conflicts around the globe. And we're also in this chapter going to talk Spanish-American War and the building of the Panama Canal. So first of all, during a good chunk of this time period, Teddy Roosevelt is president of the United States. We're going to learn a lot more about Teddy. He's one of my favorite presidents to talk about just because he's so kind of complicated and energetic, and there are a lot of crazy stories about Teddy Roosevelt, but this is his home that's been preserved, one of his homes. They had a lot of money, and this is one of the homes in New York that you can visit today that's a preserved Roosevelt home. So Teddy Roosevelt was an avid outdoorsman. He loved the West. I'll read you more stories about that, but it was one of the places that he kind of considered one of his sanctuaries. He is largely responsible for a lot of the preservation and conservation movements that happen out west. There are some really important thinkers that are doing that thinking, but he has the power to make it all come to fruition. So Teddy Roosevelt is responsible for some of your national parks and things like that. For a conservationist, though, he certainly did enjoy hunting. He went on a number of big safari hunts in his lifetime, had quite a collection of large animals, animals in general, but especially enjoyed hunting large animals. Went to Africa more than once and went on safari. He was also Assistant Secretary to the Navy. In addition to New York Police Commissioner, he was a governor. He was all sorts of things besides being president. And actually his kind of temperament, because they were fearful, he was such a kind of a go-getter, and they couldn't predict what he was going to do. They decided to hide him in the vice presidential role. And then sure enough, the president of the United States was shot, and Teddy Roosevelt, who was hidden away in that VP role, all of a sudden became president of the United States. He had gone to Harvard, grew up rather sickly, but kind of transformed his own body in part due to his own sheer will, and wrestled, rode, and then from that point forward really was an avid sportsman. He would just as likely have a meeting as he would to have a foreign minister come over and go swimming with him or play tennis with him while they talked, while he was in the White House. So he's quite a character. He had a really privileged upbringing. He was part of a big family, really sick as he was growing up, but traveled the world and was educated by some of the best nannies and governesses and tutors, and traveled to sites to learn about, for example, he went to Egypt and stayed on the Nile River for months to learn about that culture and that area with his family. Pretty amazing opportunities that he had growing up. So as we talk about imperialism, in part it happens due to the kind of character of our president at the time, and it also has in part to do with what was happening around the world at the time. 4 sections. Imperialism is in some ways an extension of manifest destiny. When we talk about manifest destiny, we're talking about kind of the settlement of a continental United States and our kind of the view that it was almost our God-given responsibility to move and civilize and settle the continental United States before somebody else was able to stake claim. But once we ran out of kind of the continental United States, the expansion overseas is imperialism. It's kind of the difference between the two. Away we go with your intro. In 1893, Queen Liliuokalani realized that her reign in Hawaii had come to an end. More than 160 U.S. sailors and Marines stood ready to aid the haoles, white foreigners, who planned to overthrow the Hawaiian monarchy. In an eloquent statement of protest, the proud monarch surrendered to the superior forces of the United States. I, Liliuokalani, do hereby solemnly protest against any and all acts done against myself and the constitutional government of the Hawaiian Kingdom. But now, to avoid any collision of armed forces and perhaps loss of life, I do, under this protest, yield my authority to the government of the United States. The U.S. ambassador to Hawaii, John Stevens, informed the State Department, the Hawaiian pear is now fully ripe, and this is the golden hour for the United States to pluck it. The annexation of Hawaii was only one of the goals of the American empire builders in the late 19th century. And on a side note, Queen Liliuokalani was responsible for some pretty familiar music to you. She wrote poetry and song, and this piece that I'm sure you recognize is called Aloha Oe, which is a greeting and a goodbye in Hawaii. So we're going to talk about the causes of imperialism today. We'll also talk about a guy named Alfred Mahan. I think we'll get to William Seward. And we'll talk about Alaska and Hawaii being some of our first acquisitions in the United States. Americans had always sought to expand the size of their nation, and throughout the 19th century, they extended their control toward the Pacific Ocean. However, by the 1880s, many American leaders had become convinced the United States should join other imperialist powers of Europe and establish colonies overseas. Imperialism, which is the policy in which stronger nations extend their economic, political, and military control over weaker nations, was already a trend around the world. One of the first causes of imperialism is global competition. European nations had been establishing colonies for centuries. In the late 19th century, Africa had emerged as a prime target of European expansionism. And by the early 20th century, only 2 countries in all of Africa, Ethiopia and Liberia, remained independent. Imperialists also competed for territory in Asia, especially in China. In its late 19th century reform era, Japan replaced its old feudal order with a strong central government. Hoping that military strength would bolster industrialization, Japan joined European nations in competition for China in the 1890s. Most Americans gradually warmed up to the idea of expansion overseas. With a belief in manifest destiny, they'd already pushed the U.S. border all the way to the Pacific Ocean. 3 factors fueled this new American imperialism. 1 was a desire for military strength. Number 2 was a thirst for new markets. The United States had gone through a period of industrialization. We needed to be able to sell the products we were making to someone else. And lastly, maybe most controversially, a belief in something called cultural superiority. We'll be exploring that later on by reading something called The White Man's Burden, doing some little Kipling, and then talking about the brown man's burden, which is, kind of the brown people's response to all that. One of the second causes of imperialism is this desire for military strength. So seeing that other nations were establishing a global military presence, American leaders advised that the United States needed to build up its own military strength. One of the reasons for this was to be able to compete, but another reason was to protect itself. I mean, what if these imperialist nations decided they were going to come here, Alfred T. Mahan of the United States Navy urged government officials to build up American naval power in order to compete with other powerful nations. As a result, of the urging of Mahan and others, the United States built 9 steel-hulled cruisers between 1883 and 1890. The construction of these modern battleships, such as the Maine and the Oregon, the Maine, which is going to come back and be part of another story that we talk about, transformed the country into the world's 3rd largest military power in the early 1900s. Alfred Mahan published a book called The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, and it just so happened that Teddy Roosevelt was an absolutely avid reader. He read, like, some people say he's read as much as 9 books a day, and this is crazy stuff. He also spoke a number of different languages and oftentimes read books in their native tongue, fearing that, in the translation something might have been lost. But anyway, one of the books he read was Alfred T. Mahan's book, and so when he became Assistant Secretary to the Navy and then later President of the United States, he had these ideas in the back of his mind as what the United States should do. One of the things the United States needed to do if they were going to create this big Navy is think about, strategically located ports. How are you going to fuel these ships that you now build? How are you going to, stop and fix or stop and let your crew off, stop and refuel, get supplies? How are you going to move from the west coast of the United States quickly to the east coast? Do you need to develop 2 navies, or do you have a canal zone that allows for kind of quicker movement of troops and then also, of course, quicker movement of trade supplies? So many nations were fighting over Africa, and we also talked about them carving up China as well. You can see British, Germany, Japan, Russia, the United States are all kind of peeking in on the map of China. One of the other causes of imperialism was this thirst for new markets. In the 19th century, advances in technology enabled American farms and factories to produce way more than American citizens could consume. So now the United States needed both raw materials for its factories to fuel its industrial revolution, but then also new markets for its agriculture and manufactured goods to be sold to. Imperialists viewed foreign trade as a solution to all kinds of issues like American overproduction, related unemployment, economic depression. All sorts of things were supposed to be helped by this. In addition, the United States, as the Industrial Revolution got brewing, we were moving through some of our raw materials rather quickly. And colonies, overseas colonies, was just one of the ways that you could gather those resources and maintain self-sufficiency for yourself. Lastly, the last cause of imperialism that we'll talk about is this belief in cultural superiority, which is maybe the more abstract and a little difficult to understand. So cultural factors were also used to justify imperialism. If you remember in the last chapter, we talked a little bit about Charles Darwin and Herbert Spencer, and Herbert Spencer saying, survival of the fittest actually also applies to society as well. Well, some Americans combined that philosophy of social Darwinism, a belief that free market competition would lead to the survival of the fittest, with a belief of the racial superiority of Anglo-Saxons. They argued the United States had a responsibility to spread Christianity and to civilize the world's inferior peoples. This viewpoint narrowly defines what civilization is, according to, our standards of what is civilized. So dangerous, racist, all sorts of things are, wrong with that. However, it was very much a product of the time period, and it certainly was a belief held by people other than just the people of the United States. Okay. I'm going to run out of time here. I have 30 more seconds. I'm going to have you watch a little bit of Rough Riders now. In the opening scene, please pay attention to Teddy Roosevelt speaking at the War Naval College. And what is he saying about imperialism? What is he saying about what the United States should be doing next? in order to, kind of take its place on the world stage. Listen very carefully and also watch for the character of Roosevelt to be revealed in this film. Thank you.